Israel and Iran carried on fighting this morning hours after a ceasefire was set to come into effect. Donald Trump initially announced the agreement on social media last night, but this morning the president accused both sides of breaking the pact.
I didn't like plenty of things I saw yesterday. I didn't like the fact that Israel unloaded right after we made the deal. They didn't have to unload. And I didn't like the fact that the retaliation was very strong. That's not what we want, I'll tell you. And I'm telling you, I'm not happy about that, Israel, either.
This is all unfolding while world leaders are in The Hague for the annual NATO summit, a meeting that was set to discuss defense spending and the war in Ukraine. Ambassador Douglas Lute is the former director of operations at U.S. Central Command in the Middle East and served as the United States representative to NATO. Hello.
It's good to be with you.
This ceasefire is obviously fragile. What are you looking for as we try to understand whether this can hold?
Well, I think, first of all, it'd be good to actually see a ceasefire. It turns out, a declared ceasefire that neither the two warring parties, neither Israel nor Iran, actually abided by. So it's not clear there actually is a ceasefire. So the first thing we'd have to see is at least a pause or slowing of the tempo of attacks between Israel and Iran.
We've seen Donald Trump get quite angry with both Israel and Iran this morning. An ally of Israel, certainly President Trump is, but he specifically warned them not to strike Iran, saying in a social media post, "Bring your pilots home now." What is your sense of how much power Trump has in this conflict?
Well, look, I don't think any president yelling at allies is going to have a meaningful effect. If that ally judges that it's in that ally's interest to continue to pursue a particular course of action. So if it's in Israel's assessment that it's in Israel's interest to pursue, they will, and no matter what Donald Trump says.
And the strike itself, Anthony Blinken had a piece, the former U.S. Secretary of State in the New York Times today, saying Trump's Iran strike was a mistake. I hope it succeeds. How do you view the U.S. involvement in this moment more broadly?
Well, I think we can't tell yet. I understand Tony Blinken's assessment, but frankly, we're in the sort of day after period where there are many more questions than there are answers. So will the U.S. strike, on top of the days of Israeli strikes, move us closer to negotiations, or will it block negotiations? What effect will it have on the Iranian nuclear program? Will it eliminate or obliterate the program? Unlikely. Or will it pause it, delay it? Or will it potentially even accelerate the program as Iran concludes that it has to rush to a nuclear capability? What about the region? Do these strikes contain the conflict into the airspace over Iran and Israel, or does it actually broaden? Now, we saw at least a hint of that yesterday with the retaliatory strike by Iran on the U.S. airbase in Qatar. And then finally, I think more strategically, and a point we may be missing as we look at the day-to-day events, is what's the longer-range impact on nuclear proliferation? States that want to guarantee their own security, do they draw the lesson from this Iran episode that they should rush quietly to acquire their own nuclear capability? Or on the other hand, do they draw the conclusion that trying to do so will only bring war? So there are a lot of unanswered questions here.
Well, and even with Iran itself, the question of whether, we still don't ultimately have a sense of what this did to their nuclear capacity, and the question of whether this might provoke a further sprint. I'm curious to what extent you think we will ultimately know what this has done, in the coming months or weeks, what this has done to Iran's capacity.
Well, we have two best sources of what's actually going on inside Iran. The long-standing source of information, reliable information, verifiable information on the Iranian nuclear program has been the IAEA, the UN-based International Agency for Atomic Energy. And those inspectors and the sensors and cameras and so forth that they've installed over the years have been very reliable over the years. Now, that's slowed down over the last couple of years, but the IAEA still is a good source of information. The other major source is the penetration of Iranian space, to include its nuclear program, by Mossad. The leading Israeli intelligence agency. So they've got much better eyes and ears on this than we do from the outside.
As the world leaders meet at this NATO summit, I wonder how much influence you think NATO partners, including Canada, are likely to have on the way Trump approaches this war.
I don't think much at all, frankly. I think Donald Trump is pretty set in his ways in terms of how he's approaching the conflict in the Middle East. NATO allies can have some influence with regard to NATO issues in particular. So, for example, this move towards a commitment to spend 5% of national GDP on defense spending. I mean, that's clearly somewhat influenced by the Trump administration. I think it's frankly more influenced by the actions of Vladimir Putin. But nonetheless, I think it somewhat reflects the Trump administration. But look, I think Canadians in particular should reflect on what happened last week at the G7. And if the G7 is a prelude, this is the kind of sort of disruptive, unpredictable impact that we can expect Donald Trump to have at The Hague at the NATO summit. You
mentioned the G7, and Volodymyr Zelensky was not able to get any time with Donald Trump there. The White House is apparently, there will be a meeting between Zelensky and Trump at this NATO summit. To what extent can Volodymyr Zelensky hope to convince Trump to apply pressure on Putin, given that his attention is now that much more divided?
Well, if there's any bright hope on the horizon on this front, it might be that Donald Trump concludes from his Middle East experience that the most effective blending of techniques is when diplomacy is backed up by hard power, just as his attempts to arrive at a ceasefire and a nuclear deal with Iran ended up being backed up by the hard power of Israeli strikes and then the U.S. strike just the other day. He's denied himself the hard power backup to diplomacy in the Russia-Ukraine war. So maybe there'll be a bright light here that snaps on, and he realizes that diplomacy is best backed up by hard power.
I would be remiss if I didn't ask you in closing, you mentioned the NATO targets the 5%. To what extent do you believe that 5% is achievable for NATO members, and that even a commitment to reach it is something that will be realized? Because we know in the past, I mean, Canada is one example, allies have said, yes, this is the target, but not set forward to meet it. Canada only agreeing to do so just recently.
Right. So 5% is very ambitious. I mean, if 5% were agreed today, no ally today is at 5%. The U.S. is at 3.3 or 3.4%. So even the U.S. would have to stretch to reach 5%. But there are a couple open questions about what exactly is being agreed at the summit in The Hague. So what exactly comprises the 1.5%, which is part of the 5%, that is not hard defense spending. So these are costs, or these are expenses, investments associated with defense.
Right, it might be infrastructure, cyber, yeah.
Exactly. But exactly what's defined there? The 3.5%, which is hard defense spending, is well established in NATO documents. But the 1.5, not so much. And then the other open question is, what's the timeline that allies are pledging to meet this goal? I mean, the shortest timeline I've heard reported is 5 years. And even 5 years, of course, will be beyond Donald Trump.
Okay. Well, listen, thank you very much for your time and your insights today. Appreciate it.
Great. Good to be with you.